Okay, and we're back for the third day of the web performance extravaganzas at this year's TPAC. And today we'll talk about network diagnostics, performance.measure memory, talk about rechartering, long task attribution, and finally JS self-profiling. And Noam, do you want to kick off and present the network diagnostics part?
Yeah, so let me see. I need to, not familiar with this tool. Just pick the window, right?
There is a present now button at the bottom right that will, to pick either window or tab,
right.
either works.
Okay, do you see
my
presentation?
Yep. Or
okay, so yeah, do you see it now?
Yeah.
Full screen? Okay, so let me start. Just reintroduce myself. I'm from Microsoft. I work for Excel Online web development, and I want to talk about a proposal. It's not a spec or a draft for a spec even. It's more about understanding the need for a certain capability. I think is starting to be more and more important. So in general, just a reminder, we know that the browser provides very limited amount of network information. We have some with network information API and some other capabilities. And in general, there are many cases where application developers actually need to be able to optimize the user experience by understanding the network situation better. Yeah, and it's really hard to do without with the existing tool. What I want to focus is not on a general network diagnostic case because that's a very broad topic. I'm gonna scope it down a little bit and talk about the last mile diagnostics and even scope it even further, talking about just the local network diagnostics for the purpose of this discussion. Just in terms of terminology, when I'm talking about last mile, it's the proximity for the user agents. And this diagram actually shows an example of a common network layout architecture, especially now during the remote working, everyone working from home situation. We have a lot of time browser connected to the home Wi-Fi network, which usually directly connected to the ISP, and then through the whole network routing to our apps. Of course, the situation can be more complex, especially on corporate networks. But let's focus on the simple case for now. Okay. So an example, why would it be important to understand the connectivity of the local connection? So first thing we could tell the user, and we see it more and more now in the last probably couple of months, where we have more and more people working from home and using their local network, that they have connectivity issues, and it's really hard to determine if the users have the local connectivity problems, or it's a problem with the ISP, or a problem with our network, or anything in between. It's really impossible to tell. So at least if we can tell the user he has a local situation and he might be able to move to a place with better reception, reboot his router, or whatever troubleshooting he can do to fix the situation. Now, even if we understand the network condition, let's say there's a lot of, it has connectivity, but maybe it has a lot of noise on the network, we can actually modify the application, how the application is implemented, and by changing the network request, we're making the frequency and so on. And generally, it's probably very useful to collect this as REM data so we can analyze and optimize our user experience much better. So these are common tools that usually network admins, IT admins use for network diagnostics. And again, before everyone get worried, I'm not proposing we introduce all these tools to the browser. That's kind of a stretch, and it's probably going to be a big security concern. However, if you notice, there's one tool that pops out, which is the ping tool, which is very popular and used by many network admins for initial troubleshooting, usually. So let's cover the existing options that people have when they're building apps and they want to understand the network situation. So they can use network error logging. It doesn't provide the granularity about what really happens on the local network, but it does give us some general connectivity informations. However, we cannot use it directly to notify the user in case there's a problem when we have some local connectivity issues. The other option is using the network information API. From our experience, we actually have integrated it into our product, and it could be either too sensitive or not enough sensitive, depends on the situation. Get a lot of false positives or false negatives, and it could be very too frequent and not in many cases, and not give us what we need. And we don't want to confuse the user by alerting him too much when we detect something. And it's also not possible to configure it, right? Whatever the spec defined or the browser vendor actually decided how to implement it, that's how it will work. Other ideas is that people are commonly use is using libraries or write their own code to using network calls and try to detect connectivity responses, some error codes, and so on. We've seen also cases that people using image loading just to determine if there's an error. It has some advantages. But again, we cannot detect if there's some local network connectivity issues for the user. So I'm going to talk about two approaches I was thinking of. And if you have other ideas, of course, please share. First one is having some kind of extension to the network information API. Second one is adding a ping API. And we'll go over them right now. So network information API, as I mentioned earlier, it's not configurable, and especially not the sensitivity of when it will notify that we have a connection up or down. So now, if we extend it by adding some way to configure it, and I'm not specifying any specific API structure or interface, I'm just saying what the use case would be, I guess. So we could possibly configure the RTT round trip that we may consider it as a timeout, or if there's a few consecutive timeouts or long round trips, we can consider it a problem or something like that. We can also consider passing a callback with predefined interfaces, which will accept some information from that API and allow us to write our own custom implementation of the decision of whether the connection is up or down, right? That would probably give us more flexibility. But if we don't do that, because it's not trivial to define, the main limitation for this approach, I guess, is we require to actually agree on what determines a network connection up or down, or available, noisy or not noisy. And the problem is every application might have a different threshold or different requirements for what is considered good connectivity. I guess online gaming might require very low latency and high availability. Some other apps might can tolerate maybe longer connections with more noise on the network and so on. And that's the main limitation. So understanding that brings us the second idea, which is introducing a ping API. Essentially, the thinking is just to use the regular ping API that is used by the ping tool, which underneath it uses the ICMP protocol, sends it to the IP destination and waits a little bit. And then if a certain timeout has passed, it considers this as a lost ping reply or something like that. And again, if we ping the default gateway, it would, in most cases, would be our local network connection. Yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, for the network info API, the idea of custom thresholds seemed super interesting. Right now, we've realized that the current API is at the same time exposing too many bits and not answering people's use cases necessarily, or not all of them, as you stated out. And it's not the first time I'm hearing that, people run their own network measurements, which are active and bad, and people shouldn't be doing that, but they're doing that because the API is not sufficient. So on the NetInfo API front, I would love to have your active involvement on the repo. The API, it used to be covered in the working group. It's currently YCG only. It is, yeah, it wasn't adopted as part of the device and what's that? Device and sensors working group because of Mozilla's objections. I've since talked to Mozilla folks, and I think there is a path forward to modify the API in a way that will be that will address concerns from other vendors. So I would love more collaboration on that repo, and potentially, figuring out a better way to address those use cases. And the custom threshold idea could be an interesting one that enables people to gather a small number of bits, but the bits that they actually care about. So that, that could be interesting. Regarding the ping idea, that seems risky. I would not love for my machine to tell me you're too far away from your office router, go back to your office every time I, go and work in the kitchen. And providing that information to random web pages seem risky.
Right.
So I'd love to better understand the use cases that split out the need for local network information from, general, like how is your network doing, which is something that pages can already roughly measure.
Right. So I think I tried to articulate that. This is just an example of how we could use that ping API. Whether it's a privacy problem or not. I have a slide on that, so let's kind of let me just quickly go over the next slide, and then we can have a discussion on the privacy aspects. Okay. So this is just a proposed interface if we go with this ping idea. So it kind of mimics how ping actually behaves. I'm sure there are other ways to formalize it, I guess. In this case, I just chose to maybe have an option to send a ping and getting a reply that summarizes the results, similar to how the ping tool behaves. And alternatively, if we need more granular data, we can actually capture each of the ping replies and add them to performance observer buffer and then analyze them further if you want to. It's just an idea. We don't have to decide, or it's just want to hear what you think about this structure.
Just that, yeah, from my perspective, like the API shape matters less than the fact that you'll be exposing ping information up until the default gateway, which is not currently accessible unless people can brute force typical IP addresses for the default gateway and try to get, like, maybe it's fine to expose it because it's already exposed, because people can ping 192.168.0.254 and they'll be right most of the time, or I don't know. But yeah, I think that the privacy issues need to be addressed first before
right. This is just yeah, it's a tentative idea for an API shape. It could be structured differently. So few items that come when we talk about privacy is that an API that in order to even activate it, we need to have some kind of a prompt to the user for permission to even do this. So ask the user for approval like some other APIs do, right? And how would that look like? I mean, it is possible to actually mimic what this API proposes using existing technology. It's not going to do exactly the same thing. It's not going to give us the exact local information, but it will allow apps already do that. They already try to diagnose the network condition using various tricks and hacks and non-standard way of doing the diagnostic. So that's kind of my the way I think about it. So I'm not sure that is something that requires, but if other people think it does require a prompt, then certainly say so.
Yeah, in my view, the main difference here is that you're pinging a specific local IP address that is not web exposed.
Right. Well, the browser is not blocked from trying to access any IP address that is local, right? But
sure, but you don't know what your default, like the web content doesn't know what the default gateway is. It can guess, it can ping it, it can, this is why we have cores. Some routers may not abide well with cores, but you know, it's adding an explicit way to ping the default gateway requires, like, maybe it's fine, but yeah, it's a question.
Is there any, what I'm not sure if there's a security concern. If I can ping the local gateway, regardless of privacy, am I exposing some security risk here? And that's still need to be evaluated, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, one other concern that was raised when I started discussing this is fingerprinting risk, right? does this expose further fingerprint surface from the browser? So definitely we should not report what was the default gateway, IP address or DNS name or anything like that. We can just try to say that that was the local route, closest route round trip time. So some other techniques like the network information API rounds the round trip time to 25 millisecond buckets. It could be even more or less granular, maybe to 3 buckets, like quick, like fast, slow, medium, or something like that. Would that be sufficient to mitigate fingerprinting? I don't know. It is something we'll have to look into as well.
Okay. We have Subrata who raised his hand. So
yeah, I have 2 questions here. One is, how is it going to help in a VPN connected network? Most of our, like at Salesforce, most of our customers are already behind a VPN, and the VPN may not be near to the local territory. It may be somewhere in a geographically separate location. So how is it going to help in there? The second question would be, like, we already have a round trip time, and how would the ping response time, would it be a kind of a separate entry for irrespective of the round trip time, or will it help for the round trip time, or the round trip time will be a better alternative there instead of the ping response time?
Yeah, I'm not sure actually what the answer. Regarding VPN, definitely that changes the routing table. So that means it's. I actually tried to address it in the next slide, because we still have some questions. If we have more than one gateway, right? Specifically, if you connect to VPN, you have more than one gateway, but your default gateway would probably go to the VPN IP, right? When you're connected. And then comes the question, should we expose that you're connected to a VPN or not? Or that's even further fingerprinting surface exposure, right? That's even worse. And it's also, when you're connected to a VPN, it's probably not going to be your local network if you ping the default gateway. It's going to be wherever the VPN endpoint starts. But it will be the round trip to there, which is another information that I assume can be useful, especially the VPN stability and so on, even though it's not going to be the network. But should we report that to the app in that case? It's hard to tell. Well, I was trying to even ask if we can use this to even allow pinging even more destinations than just the default gateway, maybe any DNS name that comes from my origin or from any pre-authorized list of origins. I don't know. Some security, how to make sure no one abuses this API. So we could use some throttling to make sure not too many concurrent calls used to create some ping storm or anything like that. Ideally, a use case that's really, I think, is important is actually ability to detect congestion of the network, either local network or the network to the ISP or the nearest ISP. That's much harder to define, I guess, and harder to do securely. But that would be, I guess, the ultimate use case, much more than the ping. But I did think about starting with the ping and just to see what you hear. The main feedback I'm getting, I guess, from Yoav mostly is concern about privacy. Am I correct?
So concerns around privacy with exposing this new information that is not currently exposed, and maybe putting that behind a prompt is good enough if the prompt is, explicit enough in outlining that, this is a network diagnostic capability that the user is enabling. But personally, I'd love to see, the use cases for this information more fleshed out, because I understand the use cases for net info. I don't necessarily understand the delta between that and the need for local network diagnostics, unless you want to ship actual network diagnostics tools on the web, which is potentially a use case for, I don't know, ISPs or whatnot, but it seems a different capability.
Yeah, I mean, is there anyone else on this meeting that actually find this local diagnostics an important case? I was just wondering. Because for us, it did seem like something that we want to have a better user experience for. What's the right way of achieving that? That's the tough question, but we feel that the case is strong, but I wonder if anyone else has thoughts on that.
I guess my main question is if it's the responsibility of the web app or if it's really more of a browser responsibility and browser diagnostics to tell you that your local, kind of like Chrome's, your network is having issues and retry kind of UI, but something that works even with offline SPAs or offline apps, either a network health in the browser UI or something that's completely removed from the web content. So it's more consistent, but gives the same user feedback.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's also could be a direction. What we're thinking is more around a standard API that can be shared and not dependent on specific user agent implementation. And also the application itself could provide, could adapt, I guess, to different conditions. If it has high sensitivity, for example, it could stop sending requests and persist content for later recovery and so on.
Yeah, but that's the use case for net info, not necessarily for local net info, right?
Right.
One comment from Alex on the chat is that if this API does move forward, it needs to be async to give room for a prompt or some sort of a user visible notification that enables it. So that's good feedback. Going back to net info, I wonder if other vendors have thoughts and or appetite about what a revamped version for net info may look like that is something that they feel they can ship. Because I had good conversations with some Mozilla folks about what a revamped net info may look like, but it's not. Some of the employment situation have changed there, so.
Right. And we're all hands on deck for Quick, so this would definitely be back burner.
Okay, but other than practical, like shipping tomorrow kind of considerations, do you see a version of NetInfo that exposes granular custom information to the web app, something that you would be willing to eventually expose and ship from a privacy perspective?
I mean, maybe, but let's just cut the speculation short. I mean, I can't commit to this. Yeah.
Okay. Sudeep, you wrote on chat that you want to make a comment. Okay. Sudeep, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. Okay. Mic issues.
Okay. Well, it was certainly good feedback, and this is just the first step in this direction from my point of view.
Cool. Awesome. So yeah, just to reiterate, I would love to collaborate on the NetInfo repo, and then we can try to figure out use cases for local network diagnostics beyond what NetInfo can expose there. And Sudeep is rejoining, so maybe he can give us his comment now. Sudeep?
Hello, yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm one of the co-chairs of the Web and Networks Interest Group, and we are having similar discussions there. So 2 comments. One is around Network Info API. There is some proposals being brought in there around information about the network, particularly in the 5G space, where there's a lot of network variation seems based on cell sizes and stuff like that. There are ideas around hints being used about congestion, upcoming congestion along a road path and things like that. And if those kind of hints can be shared to apps so that apps can use that to take, let's say, do some buffering in advance or something like that. This is a proposal which has strong dependencies on information from the operator network and things like that. So I thought I'd maybe just bring that up so that you're aware that there is a similar kind of topic being discussed there. My second comment is perhaps more orthogonal to this discussion, but in this topic, I noticed that you're talking about APIs for network diagnostics. There is an idea in our interest group where it's the other way around. They are trying to extend developer tools to emulate time variant network conditions. So which means that similar to you have the hard trace format, there can be a network trace format where the network trace is taken from the real world, and you kind of prepare a trace, and then you do a play of that trace, and then you kind of test the web apps. How does the web app behave when the network conditions changes? So this kind of helps the web developer make sure that his app is able to adapt to the varying network conditions. So I thought I would just like to bring that up in this discussion because they are kind of connected to some of the discussions here. I can share 2 links in the chat window. We can always discuss this in another meeting if needed.
Thank you. The network trace idea sounds interesting in the context of maybe synthetic testing. But yeah, I think it's a somewhat orthogonal discussion, but it seems interesting. So thank you for sharing that. And yes, if you can share links where we can read more about that, that would be great.
Sure. I think there is some sort of a POC being developed by the team. So let me just check on that if that is available open source. And then if that is, I will share that link as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So anything else on the subject of network diagnostics? Any other comments, questions? Going once, going twice. Okay, so in that case, I think we can move on to memory measurements. Ulan? Cool.
Hey all. How's my audio? Can you hear me okay? Oh, cool. Hi, I'm Ulan. I work on V8 JavaScript engine and on Chrome. And in this session, I'd like to update on the new API for measuring memory. Okay, since everyone here cares about performance, let me first relate memory to performance and motivate a bit why we want to measure memory usage. Like if you have a website and its memory usage increases, there could be two reasons. One is that the developers made conscious decision to trade memory for performance. So this is a good case. But what happens also is that the memory usage grows because of the bugs that cause memory leaks. I work on V8's garbage collector, and I've seen many bugs, many memory leaks in JavaScript. And I think the way how closures work and capture variables, it's very easy to accidentally leak memory, right? And if memory leaks, if there's a memory leak, what happens is the memory usage of the website grows over time. And at some point, it will start affecting performance negatively. We will see slowdown due to paging, swapping, slowdown due to garbage collection. And a tricky part here is that such bugs are very hard to detect in local testing, because usually tests locally run for a short period of time, and memory leaks need more time to reproduce, and they also reproduce for a subset of users that perform some specific actions. So this is our main motivation, and the main use case that we focus on is how to measure memory usage from production and look at, and the use cases look at the aggregated data to detect regressions and to evaluate A/B experiments. So this is going to be useful for long-running complex web applications. The API can also be used in local testing, but in local testing, the story is different, because when testing locally, we can pass flags to the browser to like disable security, to force garbage collection. There are also other ways to measure memory locally. So our main motivation and focus here is to get data from production and look at the aggregated data. So we are not aiming to make individual calls to the API meaningful, or like focus on that. We want aggregated data. Okay, last year I gave presentation to this group and proposed APIs there. At that point, there were many unclear parts, many unknowns, but what was clear at that point already is that there is this trade-off space, and every design decisions that we make, it will move somewhere in this trade-off space. And in the meantime, API evolved, and I think it converged to this point in the trade-off space. Like the security story improved a lot. I think the interface also improved. I will describe that here. Before doing that, I'd like to acknowledge and thank people that helped and provided feedback. And I also need to be careful to not imply that everyone here supports the API and agrees with the design decisions. Okay, so this is how the API looks like, or how it can be used. It's an async method on performance object, and it returns a promise. When the method is called, it starts measurement, and then the promise will be resolved when measurement completes. I put a link to a blog post that describes how to do like proper feature detection and how to set up randomized periodic sampling that will be useful for like looking at aggregated data. Before I describe, okay, so it returns a result, but before I describe how the result looks like, I want to talk more about high-level properties of the API, and I think the best way to do it is to compare it to the non-standard performance.memory APIs that you might know. So the first thing, the scope, what exactly does the API measure? Like the websites today are complex, right? So they can embed iframes, they can run web workers, and these websites are also running on top of complex browsers, and browsers have their own heuristics on where to allocate particular iframes. Like depending on origin and on policy, they may decide to put one iframe on one heap on one process and other iframes in another heap. And in this diagram that we have, like we have two websites. Like this diagram shows a frame tree, and we have two websites. One in green has two iframes, and another one in white has one iframe. And now, what exactly the APIs are measuring? For the new API, it will measure the memory usage of the website together with iframes and workers. So this is what web developers would intuitively expect. And this also maps nicely into the spec, where we can define the scope as browsing context group with agent clusters. On the other hand, the old API, it's very easy to implement it. We just return the heap size counter, right? But what exactly it's measuring in terms of the web, it's hard to say, because it depends whether there are some other web pages that happen to be sharing the same heap. Also note that the old API may underestimate the memory usage because some iframes are not accounted, and it can also overestimate the memory usage because it accounts potentially unrelated pages. So this is one difference. Another difference is in providing diagnostic data. Like we made the interface generic so that the browsers may choose to provide more data that in order to make the results more actionable. Like it's possible to break down the memory usage by owners and the type. Like one example where it could help for is web browser could say that, hey, this memory is used by iframes, but the iframes are no longer attached to the DOM tree. So indicating that the iframes are leaking and this amount of memory is leaking. And as I said earlier, the security story improved a lot. That's because we are using cross-origin isolation. So like to explain, so the problem is if we provide this API to the web, attackers can start using the API and load cross-origin resources and get the size of that resource, and from the size, maybe some other information may be inferred, right? And this is kind of the side channel attack. And solution to that is that we require that the web page is cross-origin isolated. I will not go into details describing this mechanism. There is a link to the blog post that explains it well. But the main idea is that if the website is cross-origin isolated, we know that all resources that were loaded, they opted in to be loaded in cross-origin documents. And by doing so, they also opted it into potential side channel information leaks. There will be more discussion on this tomorrow in this session. Okay. Now, going back to the result, like imagine we called this API and we have a website that doesn't have any iframes. In that case, one way how the result could look like is this. We get the total bytes of the website and then breakdown. But in this case, the browser chose to not show any breakdown. So this is a valid implementation to not provide any breakdown. On the other hand, browser may choose to provide breakdown. In this case, the breakdown is very trivial because there's only one entry, but it's still useful to show and explain the fields. So every entry in the breakdown is an array, and every entry there describes some portion of the memory. And like first field is the bytes, how large is this portion, then to what window or iframe or worker this portion is attributed to. Note that the attribution is also a list, so it kind of allows us to indicate that there could be multiple iframes or windows, and this portion of the memory is attributed to this set. And similarly, there is a description of types or memory types. So here, this part is fully implementation dependent. Like I expect different browsers to have different types here. For example, what could be there is whether it's JavaScript memory or DOM memory, or whether the memory belongs to detached iframes or array buffers, something like that. Okay, now to a more interesting example. Let's say you have a website with multiple iframes. Like one is the same origin iframe, another is cross-origin iframe. Then the result could look like one way. It could look like this, right? The web browser managed to break down and attribute memory to all iframes and windows. So then we have 3 entries, and the sizes add up to the total memory usage. And then each attribution is a list consisting of a single entry. What could also happen is that the browser may decide that it is impossible to distinguish between the same origin iframe and the same window, and it may choose to not to do that distinction. In that case, it can group together those 2 attributions, and that's the reason why we have this as a list or array. And also, perfectly valid implementation would be to group everything together, right? Meaning that the browser cannot distinguish between those iframes or provide empty breakdown. Now, as I mentioned, attribution provides URLs, right? And with cross-origin iframes, it's a bit dangerous. Like, we don't want to expose URLs coming from cross-origin. Like, we are okay with exposing the sizes of iframes that come from cross-origin, but we don't want to expose any URLs or strings. And that's the main requirement. Like, all the strings that we provide in the result should be already known to the main origin. And I will explain it using this example. But let's say we have the foo.com, and it embeds 2 iframes. One is same origin iframe, and another one is a cross-origin iframe. And let's also assume that same origin iframe redirects internally to another URL. Then the result that we will see for the same origin, the URL field will contain the most recent URL of the document of this. So since it's redirected to the iframe, to another URL, it will contain that URL. The scope will be window, indicating that it's an iframe. And we will have additional container field describing the iframe attributes. And in this case, you see they match. We have ID and source is a source URL before redirect. That's the one that was provided to the iframe. Why we need this is for the case of cross-origin iframes. In that case, we cannot give the URL, the current URL, because that one would be leaking information. So instead, we provide some sentinel value. Like, if you have better suggestions, welcome. So by now we are going with cross-origin URL, and the scope, we are not even saying that it is a window, because the iframe itself could contain other iframes and could start workers. So we provided the scope as a cross-origin aggregated sentinel. And the most useful data then for the page is container element, because using the container, then the original page that's calling this API can figure out that this is the iframe that retains that memory.
Can you repeat the point about the URL exposure? Because I think I somewhat that. So if I understand correctly, you can expose the redirected URLs for same origin, but cannot expose them for cross origin. Is that the distinction?
That's correct. Like, for the same origin, we can provide any information, because that information is already known to the origin. So in that case, providing the most recent URL is useful. But for cross-origin iframes, we can only provide what the main origin knows, and main origin knows the source attribute of the iframe or attributes of the iframe, but the most recent URL is not provided. Right. So now regarding the latest status, the API is in origin trial in Chrome. Effectively, the origin trial is running from 85 to 87, like from September to January. It started earlier, like in 82, 83, but we had a bug in the implementation and had to pause the origin trial. The origin trial is running with some differences to the spec and what I presented here. The main difference is the security mechanism. Like, since not all users rolled out the cross-origin isolation, we are relying on the site isolation, the mechanism that the old API also used. This means that the scope is more limited. Like, we cannot show cross-site iframes and only get the same site iframes. And additionally, the version that's running in origin trial is using simpler attribution format. Then Chrome 87 added support for worker memory, and that was not possible. This is something new. Like, previously, it was not possible to measure memory of workers with the old API. And the plans for Chrome 88 is this will be the version where we will switch to the gating behind cross-origin isolated. We will also, together with that switch, we will update the attribution format. We need to sync with the origin trial users because this is going to be a breaking change. And we will add support for cross-site iframes and ship, hopefully. I can give like some feedbacks that we received, describe feedbacks that we received. Mozilla folks looked at the API and provided very useful feedback. Main concerns there were around interop and around highlighting that the data returned or the result is specific to the browser. So based on their suggestion, we made that we renamed. Initially, we had the memory types as simply types. Now they are called user agent specific types. There is one open issue whether we want to rename bytes into user agent specific bytes. I'm curious to learn what this forum thinks about that. For me personally, it seems that obvious that bytes should be specific to the browser, but maybe we want to highlight that even more. But then if we do that, maybe we then want to add like additional object that just is named user agent specific, and then the result will become a field of that object because all fields may become user agent specific. Then there was one more suggestion to introduce dummy entries and randomize order of entries in the breakdown list. I would also curious to learn your opinion here. So the idea here is to prevent users from hard coding like specific indices in the breakdown, like breakdown 0 always means main window or something like that. And there's another open question is what should be the scope of the API? Like currently we are going with the scope that is in what developers would expect, like the whole web page together with all iframes, same origin, cross origin. But an alternative there is to limit the, like still look at the browsing context group or the web page, but limit it to the current process. It's better than what we had before with the legacy API because this would not include unrelated pages, but it would be limited to a process and it would then depend on the process model. So there is an open issue. And if you have opinions, like I'm very curious. Other feedbacks that we received from users was that in the origin trial version, promise may take a long time to resolve. And this is kind of expected because the way how we implement it is we fold the measurement into garbage collection. So the measurement actually happens with the next garbage collection. We do it in order to reduce the overhead. Otherwise, the alternative would be to iterate the heap, and that would be very costly. But in local, like this only affects production. In local testing, we can always pass a flag and to force immediate resolution of the promise. It would just force UC. Another feedback was that the worker memory is useful, and this is the thing that was not possible previously. that's all from my side. If there are any questions.
So you mentioned the reported bytes. Like, what kind of bytes are they?
So the bytes are the sizes of objects that were allocated by this browsing context group. And it depends on, like, it's fully implementation specific, what exactly that means and on what heap these bytes are coming from. But the high level idea is if you have an object and like we would look at all objects and then sum up their sizes.
I mean, I understand the object part. Like the part I don't understand is what kind of size we're reporting. Like, so let's see. Like, I don't want to elong this discussion too much, but I do a lot of like I not really do. I did used to do a lot of memory use analysis. One thing that is very interesting is the fact, for example, in many operating systems, modern operating systems at least, you have a memory compressor, right? So you end up compressing some memory. So the actual bytes in a physical sense is different from the number of bytes that you may see in your virtual address space. Now, another thing that's important is the distinction between dirty bytes versus the non-dirty bits, right? So if you have a non-dirty memory that is mapped from somewhere else, then that memory could be purged by OS. So the cost of that is different from dirty memory. And even for dirty memory, depending on what kind of dirty memory you have, if it's a completely empty page that's dirty, like you compressor can take care of that to make it very small, right? So the cost of that is actually smaller than the dirty memory that has a very high sort of entropy of information in it. So I mean, another interesting thing is like how much of the memory is getting written and read at the same time. Like what part of it is the active, right? Like that's also the interesting piece of like a memory pressure. So
in Chrome, like I think it depends on the implementation and what the implementation chooses. In Chrome, we don't try to approximate what the actual physical memory usage would be. We report the sizes as we allocate them, and these are the virtual, like you could describe it as a virtual sizes, right? And if operating system underneath does some optimizations, that would not be captured. And I think that may be useful. I'm not sure how to spec that, but there are also fingerprinting concerns, right? And it's useful to avoid exposing too much of the system information. So, and regarding the non-dirty memory, I guess those the memory that was mapped, I guess that's mostly the shared memory, right? That was existing before, like, well, at startup of the instance of web page. And also to avoid fingerprinting, these kind of memory should not be surfaced. So the idea is to only surface the memory that the web page actually allocates on top of what the baseline is.
Yeah, but for example, if you have a blob and map the content of blob into array buffer, you could imagine the one implementation of that is just map the file into memory, right? And then you have a clean memory versus dirty memory. So, I mean, yeah, I guess if the definition of bytes is complete implementation dependent, like we could do whatever, right? I mean, in extreme case, you could just, in theory, just report a random number, like.
Yeah. We could test some cases. For example, we could allocate an array buffer and write bytes there, and then expect some meaningful result. Like it's not complete, should not be completely random.
Right, but if that's the case, though, it seems like saying that it's a complete implementation dependent number, like doesn't seem like right. Like there needs to be some sort of constraint about what kind of bytes we are reporting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Such great work on this over the last year. Really huge thanks. Really impressed with this work, and I like the way this is shaping up. Such great work. Really appreciative. One of my questions is, I think the course check is a real breakthrough, and do you think doing kind of privacy review now will help kind of move the open issues into resolved issues? Like, what's your plan for staging that?
So there are most of the open issues here, like there are 3 open issues on the GitHub, and I will link to them. They are about interrupts, 2 of them about like naming. I think we could resolve that, so they're not related to privacy. The other one is interesting. So it's about the scope of the API and whether, and it somehow relates to security in a sense that if we make the scope very limited, limit to the same process, it should improve security because we will not get any data from other processes. But as a trade-off here, it would make then the result very much dependent on the process model of the browser. So if a web page runs on one device and the same web page runs on another device, we could get very different numbers there.
I was wondering, in terms of attribution, does this API actually distinguish between, you mentioned JavaScript heap, I guess, and DOM heap, and GPU memory usage?
Mm-hmm. The plans are to, currently what runs in Origin trial, it provides only JavaScript memory, and the plans in the future is to also include DOM memory and potentially also GPU memory. So yeah, it's possible. We will add them and they will be distinct, like it will distinct, at least in Chrome. In other browsers may be different.
But with the GPU memory, would be able to expose the total available GPU memory, because in contrast to the general RAM, I guess, where the OS usually uses paging or any other strategies to deal with memory stress. Once the GPU memory is full, I guess, bad things happen, and usually it's not handled very well. So I wonder if we can get signals about the total available GPU memory and the attribution of different parts of the app.
So the way how it would work, it says not implemented, right? But the way how I imagine it would work is that we would approximate the GPU memory. Like we would not get real GPU memory, but from the things that we know in this current process, like canvas elements, we would approximate how much GPU memory that uses and provide that as an approximation. I think providing the capabilities, like the limit of the GPU memory, it may be out of scope of this API. It's most then moves in the direction of like describing what this device, like what are the capabilities of the device, and that requires like different privacy and like security review because the concerns are different there.
Yeah, I mean, in practice, the GPU memory is already exposed, at least in Chrome. It's easy to create a simple script to estimate the GPU memory by allocating canvases. So it's not like you would providing additional information that's not easily accessible. I mean, that's the way I see it.
I have a quick question. You said this was an Origin trial, right? Have there been any success stories of real regressions found using this?
Not yet. So Origin trial is running for a long time, but it was paused. And so we only restarted it in September, and I hope in coming like maybe in months we may get something, but not right now.
Okay. Such a story could make this more compelling. It's a little abstract right now. I mean, I definitely understand the value of it, but having something more concrete would be more compelling.
Mm-hmm. So what do folks think about the scope, or is there any opinion?
I mean, I found your arguments on the issue, if you click through, like pretty compelling, just in terms of user friendliness or web developer friendliness and like predictability.
I have to really leave, but I have a bit of concern about the reporting any memory usage from the cross origin in iframes, because that kind of constraints ways we can change the behavior of cross origin iframes. It also limits, or like rather exposes the way process separation is done. Like yeah.
Just to emphasize, this is only for pages that are cross-origin isolated. So
True.
with corp enabled by all those iframes and all their resources they load.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
Ryosuke, does that address
Yeah,
your
but
concerns?
we still have a cross-origin iframes, right? You're saying you're going to report the memory usage cross-origin iframes embedded inside other iframes.
Yeah, they are cross-origin iframes that are corp enabled and that opt into the same embedder policy, like to an embedder.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether they use corp or anything would really change my concern. Like my concern is about exposing any memory information about cross-origin content.
Mm-hmm. That's because of the information leak, or I didn't understand the part about process separation.
Because of the fact that it would expose the way browser strategy for the how process is split.
I think Ulan's.
I think it would not be visible whether or observable whether cross-origin iframe is in the same process or in another, because we report on the allocated objects, right, by the iframe.
Well, I mean, based on the memory usage, you can infer. Anyways, I have to read that, so yeah.
Is it a good opportunity to move on to the next topic?
Yeah. So let's talk about rechartering. Let me. Share my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. So essentially, we were scheduled to be rechartered back in June, but we extended the old charter in order to better accommodate Process 2020, and because the group showed desire to move to living standards and specifically to switch to the CR draft model, where we get specifications from working drafts to CRs, and then they remain there forever, and we just update the CR once in a while with various drafts and updates. We have a new charter doc. There's a draft that I linked to from here, and we can probably also link to from the minutes. And I'd highly appreciate if you can review that charter draft. It doesn't change a ton other than the small bureaucratic bits of what deliverables we are planning to deliver and when. It does change, like there are some changes around making the scope a bit more explicit, because I found the previous scope to be a bit vague in terms of covering everything that somehow improves the user experience. So I drafted some language around making it more explicit and splitting the different categories of improvement into measurement, scheduling, and adaptation, which covers all the deliverables we have today as well as ones we had in the past. But I'd highly appreciate if you all could review that draft and let me know what you think. On the practical front, I believe that we have a couple of specs that we can potentially bring to rec before the charter is complete, or at least try to transition them to rec before the charter is complete. And Karine, I'd highly appreciate your thoughts on the feasibility of that in terms of timelines. And if we can do that, we could potentially remove them from deliverables. And then there are other specs that we could potentially bring to completion, but they are probably, in terms of timelines, that will most probably happen after the rechartering. And otherwise, for both preload and resource hints, we talked about dismantling resource hints and then moving bits and pieces directly to be integrated into HTML. It's unclear to me if we should just remove them as a deliverable entirely, or have a section stating that they are deliverables in transition, because we won't finish that work before the rechartering. So Karine, on that front as well, I'd love your opinion. And then for everything else, all the other specs that we won't bring to completion or transition, the plan is to just get them to CR, and then forevermore just include all updates as a CR draft, and once in a while run a snapshot. I'm not yet sure on what the mechanics of that would be, but I don't think we need to concern ourselves with that right now. And other than that, we have a bunch of specs that where we would love a helping hand, and we already mentioned that as part of the intro. A bunch of specs where editors are needed. So if anyone is interested in contributing to specs or getting started with contributing to specs with help from the chairs and other active editors, that seems like a good opportunity to get started. So if anyone is interested, please don't hesitate.
Do you have any guidance towards what kind of effort or commitment or work would need to be done for some of those at all?
So I think that the level of effort varies based on the different specs, but generally, yeah, even if you have a few hours a week that you could dedicate to this subject, it would be highly appreciated, and we would love the help in order to move those spec forwards, make sure they're well maintained, and issues don't lag. So does that cover what you had in mind?
Yeah. Didn't want to scare people off too much by asking for help, but just kind of want to be upfront and around.
Yeah.
What the ask is.
Yeah. So essentially, if you're interested in the subject of specifications and willing to contribute a few hours a week, even, we would love to, help you get started and help you be successful with that. Yeah, and otherwise, so Karine, are you on the call or?
Yes, I am. Do you want to go back to your first slide? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Yeah. So
the first question was about going to recommendation, possibility to going to recommendation before the end of the year.
Yes, for both resource timing L1 and page visibility L2. L1 is really complete, and L2, we have one final issue, but we have a good plan of how to resolve it. So we could potentially do that rather quickly if there is a prospect of moving it to rec before we recharter. Otherwise, we can just leave it as a deliverable and aim to get it to rec next quarter. But yeah.
Okay, so 2 questions actually. You want to remove it from the charter, but we need a working group to commit to maintain it after recommendation anyway. So it can't really get, well, we can't really get rid of them. So does that make a big difference? Maybe your question is still valid if we keep it as a maintenance.
Yeah. So we plan to keep maintaining both of the. So resource timing L1 will be done, but resource timing L2 will not be. It's just that currently we have both of them as deliverables in the charter, and it would be good to clean up the L1 bit. And obviously, we're still committed to maintaining and keeping L2 as a living standard. As for page visibility, I think it will be a similar situation where we will be done with L2, and then L3 would become a living standard with, for example, the pre-rendering additions that we talked about yesterday or the day before. So I don't necessarily want to remove the deliverables altogether, but just to, like, at least for the resource timing one, clean up the fact that we have 2 different levels as a deliverable.
But we really want a recommendation of the first level.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm looking at technically we have 2 months and a half. That's going to be tricky. Technically it should be possible to go to recommendation if we really ask to progress right now. So do we need a CR for this one?
I think it's already in PR.
It's already CR, but do we need a new one, or are there modifications compared to the previous one?
I don't believe there was. It's just that we somewhat forgot to move it to rec. It would be good.
So we can request proposed recommendation, and it's a 1 month procedure to get the ACE vote on it and get to recommendation. So yes, we should be able to do that before the end of the year. Second one is page visibility.
Yeah.
And that's a level 2. You want to have it as no, you don't want it as a living standard, right?
So ideally, we could have L2 go to rec because it's already in PR, and then have L3 be a living standard with whatever changes we add in the future.
Okay. I'm not sure whether we want to enable 2 as the living standard, actually. You anticipate that level 3 will be highly different?
We will potentially. I don't know if you attended the pre-rendering discussion the other day, but potentially we would be interested in adding more modes or more signals as to whether the page is visible or previewed or pre-rendered, or some of those or all of those. So yes, there will be an API change. Are you saying that from your perspective, you prefer that we'll just take L2 to be the living standard and perform those changes there?
That's a possibility. I don't say that it's the right thing to do, but well, it depends on the approach that the working group wants for versioning. Use levels for the moment, but we didn't have the ability in the process to evolve. Now that we have the ability to have the living standard, then that's different. Maybe the question is, do we just enrich the APIs so it's never breaking up what exists? So we don't really need versioning in that case. That's it. I personally think that versioning is not bad, but
yeah,
when done correctly.
In any case, it would need to be backwards compatible. So I think either way would work. Benjamin, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to get some clarity here. Thanks so much for this discussion. This is great. I wanted more clarity about the living standards part. So when we say don't break, does that mean we can't remove interfaces? Is there some kind of more formal definition about how this evolves? And the second question is, for versioning, can we just say page visibility year 2020 as a designation? I mean, is that a subversioning, or what possibilities exist here? Just can you explore the space with us, please?
So the living standard, the difference between the going to recommendation the old way and now going to recommendation as a living standard is that we will be able to have changes done to the spec. When you enter proposed recommendation, you have to say that this is going to be a living standard. That's the first step. And once you are in recommendation with that, you are allowed to go through a different process to amend the recommendation, which is kind of combining the patent protection that currently is done at CR and the AC vote that is done as PR. So changing a recommendation should be much quicker. The other change is that the CRs, the CR drafts and CR snapshot are distinguished, whereas before some CRs were editorial and some CRs were substantive, and so some triggered patent policy actions and some did not. It was quite confusing, but that's not related to living standard. That's going to apply to all specifications. The only thing about living standard is about amending and changing recommendation in place. So it means that it's the same spec that is going to be changed. If you add an API to a spec that already exists, it's going to be possible, whereas so far it was not.
And where is the point for the disposition of comments to indicate this change in a living standard?
So currently the implementation of that process is not entirely clear, but there's something in the process called last call for review of an amended recommendation or a proposed change. I don't recall. There are two different flavors of that. And that is going to be a kind of CR/PR mix of review. That's going to be normally that should lead to recommendations that are amended in the same at the same URI. You will have a new spec with additional content.
And just to clarify, in the previous discussion when we talked about, we concluded that the living standard variant of amended rec is something that will have relatively high overhead. So we prefer to go with the CR draft version of the living standard. So basically IP commitments happen in CR, and then drafts from that point on. So draft snapshots will be the tip of tree.
So the difference also for that is that previously, if you wanted to add a feature to a recommendation, let's say you had an entire API to an API that already exists, and you want to add a new one in it, and for that you had to go to first public working draft, and it was an entire new track. And now, if your recommendation was marked as living standard, you can incorporate that and directly go to CR. And you publish a CR snapshot because it has the patent policy protection. And then you publish drafts regularly, all the time when you update the text and all that. And snapshots are really the patent policy things. And yeah, you don't really need to go to recommendation again, but if your spec is sufficiently mature at some point, probably you want to do that. I mean, you don't have levels, but when you think that your level 2 is done, you publish it as a recommendation, and you work on level 3 as a CR directly without going back to first public working draft. Still the same thing, it's the living standard. And then you work on it, and when it's ready, you want to publish a new recommendation.
Yeah, I think that piece will probably have to see when we get closer to an existing example. But yeah, maybe we could take try that out with page visibility and then move it to rec as a living standard, and then bring it back to CR to add the pre-rendering related bits or something like that. Yeah.
That does not prevent from publishing a level 3 as a first public working draft if we change your mind later. I think.
Yeah.
It is not mandatory that everything that is related to page visibility will be in the living standard either. So I think the process does not make it impossible to take things back and put them somewhere else.
Okay.
Hey, Yoav and Nick, this is Mike Smith from W3C. Sorry to butt in. I've been in other meetings, but I wanted to talk about one thing that Benjamin asked specifically. So first, I work for W3C. I'm based in Tokyo, and worked on a lot of the transitions. But Benjamin asked this interesting question, which is it considered a breaking change if you remove an API or things like that? so the general answer I think that we have for that is we say that if any change you make will invalidate someone's previous review, then you should give your reviewers an opportunity for re-review. Another way to look at that is think about it yourself. If you've taken time to review another group's spec, some other spec, and you end up finding out after the fact that they made a change and went ahead and transitioned in a way that just invalidated the previous review that you did, it doesn't make you feel super great. So part of it's just being considerate about the community of people who've taken time to review your spec and give you feedback, and just consider, would some change that you make be something that they would like to have an opportunity to re-review?
But I'm still not getting great answers as to how disposition of comments work. On tag review of this working group, that was one of the things I noticed in the documents in general, was that that seems kind of ad hoc for this group. And so I'm just hoping that there is a place where these re-reviews can happen and that they're noted in the doc, and that place is usually disposition of comments from what I can tell. So I just want to make sure that we track these reviews and comments. It makes it a lot easier for people in other working groups to see what we're up to and to establish history.
Do you have an example of other specs that have something along those lines? I'm not sure I get.
Yeah, I did have one. Tantek had one, and I will follow up with you on that. I was trying to find it this morning, but I can't. So I don't have a great example for you, but we'll provide one for you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, maybe we can talk about that offline, but that sounds generally useful. I'm not sure the exact shape of what you're proposing. So
yeah, I mean, and it would track things like right now for Web Vitals, you have a changelog, which is really useful, but this would be a way to track those types of changes in the doc. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, so we had the question about publishing, which we covered. The other question I had for W3C folks is, should we remove preload and resource hints as deliverables, or can we add them as a separate section for deliverables in transition? How does that work for things that are in flight for transitions between the W3C and the 1WG?
Yeah, so my feeling was that if we don't plan to republish them under this group's responsibility, then it should be removed from the normative deliverable section. Maybe put it somewhere else because for AC review of the charter, it will be interesting for people to know what's happening to those specs. So it's still interesting to have wording on that front.
Okay.
So we can do non-normative text there. That'll work.
So that we don't have such a section in the charter template. We don't have a section for things that we transfer to somewhere else. So that's going to be more or less freestyle spec section of the charter. I was suggesting maybe under the either other deliverables or in the section where we have liaison to other groups, external organization, I think it is.
Okay.
Where we had the 2 lines about what working group.
Okay. So to clarify, is it the case that the content of those specifications is being integrated into the HTML spec?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah. So yeah, that happens. That's happened in the past, of course, with a number of other things. But I would just say that when that does happen, along with whatever else you do, what we're just talking about now, please make sure ultimately that Philippe is aware of what's going on, because the relationship with WebPerfWG, you know, we had this thing where we created a memo of understanding and we have steps that we are supposed to go through. I'm less enthusiastic about going through all the steps myself, but Philippe is more conscious of it. We have regular meetings with WebPerfWG, so these are some of the things we talk about. I don't think these in particular will be a big deal, but yeah, just make sure that it bubbles up at some point, all of you, to Philippe's attention, so he's, you know, he can include it in the list of stuff that we need to talk with WebPerfWG about.
Yeah, Philippe is aware, so cool.
So, Mike, were you suggesting that we should have a backup plan in case WebPerfWG change his mind or doesn't want the deliverables?
No, I mean, I don't anticipate that anybody, the HTML editors, would change their minds about integrating this particular stuff, so don't think it's a big deal.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else on the front of charters? Any other questions? Going once. So yeah, essentially, please review the draft and add comments there. And yeah, I'm hoping that we'll be able to send kick off the rechartering very soon. Okay, so thank you. I think that with that, we can go on a break that we're 10 minutes overdue for. So shall we take 10 minutes and reconvene at 50 after the hour? Okay, let's do that. So see you all in 10 minutes.